She was pregnant and chained to a wagon, until a stranger paid too and whispered, "You were promised to me." The iron burned against Sarah's wrist like a brand from hell itself. She sat in the dirt beside the wagon wheel, her back pressed against the rough wood, feeling the baby kick inside her belly as if it too wanted to escape this place. The chain that held her was thick and black, forged for cattle or worse things, and it had rubbed her skin raw during the 3-day journey from her father's failed farm to this dusty trading post where men sold women like grain. The sun stood high and merciless overhead. No clouds dared cross its path. The heat pressed down on everything, the wooden buildings with their peeling paint, the horses tied to hitching posts with their heads hanging low, the circle of men who had gathered to look at her like she was a mare they might buy for breeding. Sarah kept her eyes on the ground. She had learned not to look at their faces. Their eyes held things she did not want to see, hunger and calculation and the cold arithmetic of flesh. Her dress, once blue as summer sky, was now gray with dust and sweat. It stretched tight across her belly where the child grew, 6 months along and healthy despite everything. At least the baby was healthy. That was all that mattered now. "Look at her," one man said, his voice rough as sand. "Strong hips, good for bearing." Another man laughed, the sound ugly in the still air. "Bit used already, ain't she? That just proves she can deliver," the first man replied. "Some of these young ones, you never know if they'll survive the birthing. This one's already proven herself." Sarah's hands found her belly, covering it as if she could shield the child from their words. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and she wondered if it could hear their voices. She hoped not. She hoped the child lived in a world of warm darkness where such words could not reach. The auctioneer, a thin man with a beard like dirty straw, climbed onto a wooden crate. His voice carried across the small crowd. "Gentlemen, you see before you a fine specimen. Young, fertile, already with child. Her father owes debts, and she's the payment. Bidding starts at 50 cents. 50 cents. The price of a good meal or a bottle of whiskey." Sarah's throat closed tight. She thought of her father, gambling away their farm one card at a time, drinking away their hope one bottle at a time. When the debts came due and the men came calling, he had looked at her with eyes like empty wells and said, "I'm sorry, girl. There ain't no other way." 50 cents, called a voice from the crowd. 75, said another. $1. Sarah watched their boots in the dirt. Some were worn thin at the heels, others polished but cracked. All of them belonged to men who saw her as property, as something to be owned and used until she broke or died trying. The baby kicked again, and she pressed her hand to the spot, whispering words too soft for anyone else to hear. $1.25. $1.50. The bidding continued, each price calling out her worth in the eyes of strangers. She was worth more than 50 cents now, but still less than a good horse. The thought almost made her laugh, but there was no laughter left in her. It had dried up somewhere on the road between her father's goodbye and this moment in the dust. Then she heard new footsteps, different from the others, slower, more careful. Boots that had walked many miles but still held together. She kept her eyes down, but she could feel someone watching her from the edge of the crowd. The feeling was different too. Not the hungry stare of the other men, but something quieter, something that felt almost like sadness. $1.75, came the new voice. It was low and rough, like wind through dry grass. Sarah looked up for the first time. The man stood apart from the others, wearing a hat pulled low over his eyes. His clothes were clean but faded, and his hands hung loose at his sides. He was not young but not old either, somewhere in that space between where boys become men and men begin to break. There was something in his face that she could not name, a kind of emptiness that matched her own. $2, he said, louder this time. The other men fell quiet. $2 was good money, more than most of them had in their pockets. The auctioneer looked around the crowd, waiting for another bid, but none came. They knew when they were beaten. $2, the auctioneer called, going once, going twice. Sold to the gentleman in the brown hat. The stranger walked forward, reaching into his pocket for the coins. Silver dollars that caught the light and threw it back like tiny suns. He counted them into the auctioneer's palm without speaking, then turned to Sarah. His eyes were gray as storm clouds, and in them she saw something unexpected. Not ownership, but something closer to apology. He knelt down beside her, producing a small key from his vest pocket. The same man who had chained her here, the debt collector, had given it to the auctioneer, and now it passed to her new owner. The stranger fit the key into the lock at her wrist, and the iron fell away with a soft click. Sarah rubbed her wrist where the metal had burned her skin. The marks would fade, but she knew they would leave scars. Some things marked you forever, whether you wanted them to or not. "Can you stand?" the stranger asked. His voice was gentler now, meant only for her. She nodded and struggled to her feet, one hand on her belly for balance. The world swayed for a moment. She had been sitting in the heat too long, but his hand caught her elbow, steadying her without holding too tight. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah," she whispered. It felt strange to say it aloud. She had not spoken her own name in days. "Sarah," he repeated as if testing the sound. "My name is Jacob. You hungry?" She had not eaten since yesterday, maybe longer. Time blurred when you were afraid. But she was also wary. Men who bought women at auction did not usually worry about their hunger. "A little," she said. Jacob nodded toward a small building across the dusty street. "There's a place over there serves decent food. We'll get you something before we head out." Head out? To where? She wanted to ask, but the words would not come. Instead, she followed him across the street, her legs unsteady after sitting chained for so long. The other men watched them go, their eyes following her like wolves watching prey that had been claimed by a stronger pack. Inside the small restaurant, Jacob chose a table near the back, away from the windows. He ordered food for both of them, bread and meat and cool water, and they sat in silence while they waited. Sarah kept her hands folded on the table, not knowing what else to do with them. Freedom felt strange after the weight of chains. "You don't have to be afraid," Jacob said finally. "Not of me." Sarah looked at him across the table. In the dim light of the restaurant, his face looked tired, carved by weather and something else. Something that lived behind his eyes like an old wound that would not heal. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you buy me?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, turning his water glass in his hands. When he spoke, his words came slow and careful, like a man walking through broken glass. "Because," he said, "you were promised to me." The words hung in the air between them, strange and heavy. Sarah did not understand what he meant, but something in his voice told her that neither did he, not completely. There were mysteries here deeper than the price of flesh and blood. There were reasons that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with the kind of pain that drove men to desperate acts. Outside, the desert wind began to blow, carrying dust and the sound of distant thunder. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a storm was coming. They rode out of town as the sun began its slow fall toward the western hills. Jacob had bought her a gentle mare, brown as coffee with white markings on her face, and helped Sarah mount despite her swollen belly. The horse was patient, standing still while Sarah found her balance, one hand gripping the saddle horn and the other resting on the child that moved restlessly inside her. Jacob rode ahead on a black gelding that looked as weathered and steady as its rider. He did not speak as they left the trading post behind, did not look back at the place where men had bid on her like livestock. Sarah was grateful for the silence. Words felt too sharp right now, too likely to cut. The desert stretched out before them, endless and empty as a promise that would never be kept. Red rocks jutted up from the earth like broken teeth, and the air shimmered with heat even though evening was coming. Sarah had never been this far from home, had never seen country so wild and lonesome. It made her feel small, smaller even than sitting chained to that wagon wheel. They rode for hours without stopping. Jacob seemed to know where he was going, following trails that looked like nothing more than deer paths to Sarah's eyes. Her back began to ache from the unfamiliar saddle, and the baby pressed against her ribs with each step the mare took. But she did not complain. Complaining was a luxury she could no longer afford. When the sun touched the horizon, Jacob finally stopped beside a small creek that wound its way between two red hills. The water ran clear and cold, catching the last light and throwing it back like scattered coins. He dismounted and came to help Sarah down, his hands careful and respectful as he steadied her. "We'll camp here tonight," he said. His voice was quiet, meant not to carry beyond the circle of their small world. Sarah nodded and walked to the creek, kneeling carefully to splash water on her face and hands. The coolness felt like a blessing after the day's heat. She cupped her hands and drank, tasting snow and stone and something clean that reminded her of mornings before everything went wrong. Behind her, she heard Jacob gathering wood for a fire. He moved efficiently without wasted motion, like a man who had made camp in the wilderness many times before. When she turned back, he had already built a small circle of stones and was striking flint to tinder. The fire caught quickly, sending yellow light dancing across their faces. Jacob pulled supplies from his saddlebags, bread wrapped in cloth, dried meat, a small pot for heating water. He worked in silence, preparing food with the same careful attention he had shown in choosing their campsite. "Eat," he said when the simple meal was ready, handing her a plate of bread and meat. Sarah ate slowly, tasting each bite. The food was plain but good, better than anything she had eaten in weeks. Her father had sold most of their stores to pay gambling debts, leaving them to survive on thin soup and hope. Now even hope was gone, traded away with everything else. "Where are we going?" she asked when the worst of her hunger was satisfied. Jacob looked into the fire, watching the flames dance. "My place, up in the mountains. It's quiet there." "How far?" 3 days' ride, maybe 4 with..." He gestured toward her belly, his meaning clear without being unkind. Sarah nodded. 3 or 4 days to whatever waited for her in those distant mountains. 3 or 4 days to wonder what kind of man bought a pregnant woman at auction and then treated her with more kindness than her own father had shown. "Why did you say I was promised to you?" she asked. Jacob was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he would not answer. The fire crackled between them, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. When he finally spoke, his words came slow and heavy, like stones pulled from deep water. "I had a wife once," he said. "Her name was Mary. She was everything good in this world, gentle and kind and full of light." He paused, his hands folding and unfolding in his lap. Sarah waited, knowing that some stories could not be rushed. "She got with child," Jacob continued. "We were so happy, built a cradle, made plans, talked about names. Mary would sit by the fire in the evenings, hands on her belly, singing little songs to the baby. Sarah's own hands found her stomach, feeling the life that stirred there. She could picture it. A woman heavy with child, singing lullabies to someone she had never met but already loved more than her own life. "What happened?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew. She could hear it in his voice, see it in the way his shoulders carried more weight than any man should bear. "The birth went wrong," Jacob said. "Baby came early, too early. Mary, she fought hard, harder than anyone should have to fight. But the bleeding wouldn't stop, and the baby..." His voice broke like dry wood. "The baby never drew breath." Sarah felt tears start in her eyes. She had not cried since leaving her father's farm, had been too angry and afraid for tears. But this man's grief was so raw, so honest, that it opened something in her chest that had been locked tight. "I buried them together," Jacob said. "Mother and child in the same box, Mary's arms around our little one. I thought I would follow them soon enough. Didn't see much point in staying in a world they weren't part of." The fire popped, sending sparks up into the darkening sky. Above them, the first stars were beginning to show, distant and cold as forgotten prayers. "But you didn't," Sarah said softly. "No, I didn't. Kept waking up each morning, kept breathing each breath. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. The cabin got so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat, and it sounded wrong somehow. like it was beating for someone who wasn't there anymore. Jacob looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not desire or ownership, but recognition. The look of one broken thing seeing another. "When I heard about the auction," he said, "heard about a woman with child being sold like property, I thought maybe God was giving me a chance to do something right, to keep another woman from suffering what Mary suffered, to save a child if I couldn't save my own." Sarah understood then the terrible weight of his words back in the restaurant. She had been promised to him not by any person, but by grief itself, by the hollow space where love used to live, by the silence where laughter used to ring. He had bought her not for what she could give him, but for what he might give her: protection, safety, a chance for her child to live when his could not. "I don't expect anything from you," Jacob said quickly, as if reading her thoughts. I'm not trying to replace what I lost. I just thought maybe I could help. Maybe I could make sure your baby has a chance to grow up safe." Sarah looked at this strange man across the fire, this broken soul who had spent his last dollars to save her from a worse fate. She thought of Mary, the wife who sang to unborn children, and of the small grave that waited somewhere in the mountains ahead. She thought of her own child, kicking strong and healthy inside her, and of the chance Jacob was offering, not just to her but to himself. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with every part of her heart. Jacob nodded and looked back into the fire. "We should sleep soon. Long day tomorrow." He spread blankets on opposite sides of the fire, giving her space and privacy without making her feel abandoned. As Sarah lay down, she watched him across the dancing flames, this man who carried ghosts in his eyes and kindness in his hands. Above them, the stars grew brighter, and somewhere in the darkness, a child moved beneath her heart, as if it too understood that they were traveling towards something that might, at last, feel like home. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pines that whispered secrets to the wind. It was smaller than Sarah had imagined, built from logs that had weathered to silver gray, with a stone chimney that sent thin smoke into the mountain air. Jacob helped her down from the mare, his hands steady despite the tremor she felt in them as they approached his home. Behind the cabin, partly hidden by a stand of aspen trees, Sarah saw what made Jacob's hands shake. 2 wooden crosses stood side by side in a small plot of turned earth. Fresh flowers lay at their base, mountain laurel and wild columbine that Jacob must have picked that very morning before riding out to find her at the trading post. He saw her looking and stopped walking. For a moment they stood there in the afternoon light, the weight of his grief hanging between them like morning mist. "That's them," he said simply. "Mary and our little one." Sarah nodded, understanding without words why he had needed to buy her freedom, why he could not let another woman face childbirth alone. The grave was tended with the kind of love that refuses to let go, even when letting go might bring peace. "What was the baby's name?" she asked softly. "Hope," Jacob said, and his voice broke on the word. "We were going to call her Hope." They stood in silence for a long moment, paying respects to the woman and child who had shaped every choice Jacob made. Then Jacob picked up Sarah's small bundle of belongings and led her to the cabin door. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a wooden table and 2 chairs nearby. A bed stood in one corner, covered with a quilt that looked hand-sewn. Everything spoke of a woman's touch, of a home that had once held laughter and plans for the future. "You can have the bed," Jacob said, setting down her bundle. "I'll sleep by the fire." "Where did you sleep before?" Sarah asked. Jacob looked at the bed, and she saw pain flicker across his face. "Haven't slept in it since Mary died. Couldn't bring myself to lie where she used to sing to the baby." Sarah felt her throat tighten. This man had been living like a ghost in his own home, unable to rest in the place where love had lived and died. She wanted to say something that might ease his pain, but knew that some hurts were too deep for words. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Jacob rose early to tend the animals: 2 horses, a milk cow, and chickens that pecked around the yard. Sarah helped where she could, though her growing belly made many tasks difficult. Jacob watched her with careful eyes, as if afraid she might disappear like smoke if he looked away too long. He was gentle with her in ways that broke her heart. When she struggled to reach something on a high shelf, he was there to help before she could ask. When her back ached from the weight she carried, he would bring her a pillow without being told. When she grew tired easily, he never complained about the work left undone. But he rarely met her eyes directly, and he never touched her except to help her up or steady her when she stumbled. It was as if he was afraid that too much contact might break some fragile promise he had made to his dead wife. Sarah began to understand that Jacob was not just caring for her. He was trying to save himself. Every kindness he showed her was an act of faith, a prayer that this time things might be different. This time the woman might live. This time the baby might draw breath and cry and grow strong. The weeks passed like pages turning in a book written by someone else. Sarah's belly grew rounder, the baby more active. She would sit by the fire in the evenings, hands on her stomach, feeling the child move and kick with life that seemed too precious for this broken world. Sometimes she caught Jacob watching her with an expression she could not name. Hope and terror mixed together like water and oil. "Do you think about names?" he asked one evening as they sat by the fire. Sarah looked up from the sewing she was doing, mending a shirt of Jacob's that had torn on a fence post. "Sometimes. If it's a boy, maybe Thomas, after my grandfather. If it's a girl..." She paused, thinking of the small grave behind the cabin. "If it's a girl, maybe something strong, like Faith or Grace." Jacob nodded slowly. "Those are good names. Strong names." They fell back into comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them and the wind singing through the pines outside. Sarah had grown to love these quiet evenings, the peace that came from sitting beside someone who understood loss and did not try to fill every silence with empty words. But peace, Sarah was learning, was a fragile thing in a world that took more than it gave. The storm came in November, roaring down from the high peaks with wind that shook the cabin and snow that fell thick as wool. Sarah woke in the middle of the night to the sound of wind howling around the eaves and something else. A deep, grinding pain that started in her back and wrapped around her belly like iron bands. She lay still for a moment, hoping it was just the baby moving or the ache that came from lying too long in one position. But the pain came again, stronger this time, and she knew with cold certainty that her time had come. "Jacob," she called softly, not wanting to wake him if the pain proved false. But it came again, stealing her breath, and she called louder. "Jacob!" He was at her side in seconds, still pulling on his shirt, his hair standing up from sleep. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know. "How long?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear she saw in his eyes. "Just started," Sarah gasped as another pain gripped her. "But they're coming fast." Jacob ran his hands through his hair, thinking quickly. The storm had them trapped. No way to get to town for a doctor. No one to help but the two of them and whatever skill he might remember from Mary's long labor. His face went pale in the firelight, and Sarah saw him looking toward the door as if he might run into the storm rather than face this again. "Jacob," she said, reaching for his hand. "Look at me." He turned back to her, and she saw in his eyes the same terror that had haunted him for 2 years. The fear that he would watch another woman die, lose another child, fail again when failure meant everything. "I need you here," Sarah said, squeezing his hand. "I need you to be strong." Jacob nodded, but she could feel his hand shaking in hers. Outside, the storm raged against the cabin walls, and inside, a new life fought to enter a world that had already taken too much from the man who knelt beside her bed. "Get some water heating," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm, "and find some clean cloth. We're going to need..." The pain hit her again, harder this time, and she had to stop talking until it passed. Jacob squeezed her hand once, then moved to build up the fire and set water to boil. Sarah watched him work, this broken man who was about to face his greatest fear all over again. She thought of Mary, of little hope buried in the frozen ground outside, and wondered if love was ever strong enough to change the stories that seemed written in stone. Another pain came, and Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the baby move lower, ready to begin the journey that would either bring new life into Jacob's empty world or break what remained of his battered heart. The night stretched long as a lifetime, measured not in hours but in the spaces between Sarah's cries and the rhythm of her breathing. Jacob moved around the cabin like a man walking through memory, his hands finding what they needed without his mind having to tell them. Clean cloth, warm water, the small knife he had sharpened until it gleamed like silver in the firelight. Sarah lay on the bed where Mary had died, but Jacob pushed that thought down deep where it could not touch what was happening now. This was different. This had to be different. Sarah was strong in ways Mary had not been, her body built for the work of bringing life into the world. The baby moved lower with each pain, fighting its way toward breath and light. "How are you doing?" Jacob asked, wiping sweat from Sarah's forehead with a damp cloth. "Been better?" Sarah gasped, trying to smile through the pain. "Been worse too." Jacob knew she was thinking of the auction, of sitting chained in the dust while men bid on her like cattle. This pain had purpose, had hope at the end of it. That pain had been empty, meaningless, the kind that broke spirits without building anything new. Another contraction gripped her, and Sarah's hand found Jacob's, squeezing until he thought his bones might break. He let her hold on, let her take whatever strength she needed from him. Outside, the storm battered the cabin walls, but inside, the fire burned steady and warm, filling the small space with light that pushed back the darkness. "I can see the head," Jacob said, his voice wonderstruck despite everything. He had helped birth calves and foals, but this was different. This was a person coming into the world, small and perfect and more precious than anything he had ever held. Sarah bore down with the next pain, her face red with effort, sweat running down her cheeks like tears. Jacob caught the baby's head in his hands, feeling the slick warmth of new life, the miracle of something that had never drawn breath now fighting to do exactly that. "One more push," he said. "Come on, Sarah. One more." Sarah gathered herself, every muscle in her body working toward this moment. She pushed with everything she had left, and suddenly the baby slipped free into Jacob's waiting hands, small and purple and covered in the evidence of the journey from one world to another. For a heartbeat, the baby was silent. Jacob's blood turned to ice as he remembered another child, another night, another silence that had lasted forever. His hands shook as he turned the baby over, clearing its mouth and nose, whispering prayers he had not said since Mary died. Then the baby drew breath, and the sound that came out was the most beautiful thing Jacob had ever heard. A cry that filled the cabin, strong and angry and absolutely alive. The baby's skin turned pink, then red, as blood and breath did the work they were meant to do. "Is it?" Sarah asked, trying to lift her head to see. "She's perfect," Jacob said, tears running down his face as he wrapped the baby in clean cloth. "She's absolutely perfect." He placed the baby in Sarah's arms, watching as the new mother looked down at her daughter with wonder and exhaustion, and love so fierce, it made the air in the cabin feel holy. The baby stopped crying when she felt her mother's warmth, her tiny hand curling around Sarah's finger like an anchor to this new world. "Hello, little one," Sarah whispered. "I'm your mama." Jacob turned away, giving them privacy for their first moments together. He walked to the window and looked out at the storm, but instead of wind and snow, he saw sunlight beginning to touch the eastern hills. Dawn was coming, painting the sky pink and gold, and the baby's cries had announced its arrival like the song of morning birds. Behind him, Sarah was counting fingers and toes, marveling at the tiny fingernails and the way the baby's hair caught the firelight. Jacob listened to her soft voice talking to her daughter, and felt something inside his chest that had been frozen for 2 years begin to thaw. "Jacob," Sarah called softly, "come meet her properly." He turned back to the bed, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Sarah was sitting up now, the baby nursing contentedly, both of them looking like they belonged exactly where they were. "What will you call her?" Jacob asked, settling into the chair beside the bed. Sarah looked down at her daughter, then up at Jacob. "I was thinking about what you said, about strong names, and I thought, maybe Grace. Grace Mary, after the woman who would have loved her." Jacob felt his breath catch. To name the baby after Mary was a gift he had not expected, a kindness that reached into the deepest part of his grief and touched it with light. "Mary would have liked that," he said. "She would have loved her." They sat in comfortable silence as the baby nursed, the storm outside finally beginning to quiet. Jacob watched Sarah with her daughter and remembered the woman he had bought at auction. Afraid, alone, treated like property by men who saw only what they could take from her. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who glowed with the fierce protection that came with motherhood. "Thank you," Sarah said suddenly. "For what?" "For seeing me as more than what other people made me. For giving me a chance to be someone's mother instead of someone's property." Jacob shook his head. "You were always more than that. I just bought you time to show it." Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and the first clear light of day was streaming through the cabin windows. Jacob could see the grave behind the cabin, but it no longer looked like an ending. With new life breathing in the room, it looked like part of a story that was still being written. "We should get some rest," Jacob said. "Both of you need to sleep." Sarah nodded, settling back into the pillows with Grace cradled against her chest. "Jacob? What happens now?" It was a good question, one Jacob had been asking himself since the moment he dropped those silver dollars and bought her freedom. What did happen now? They were not husband and wife, not bound by anything except the strange circumstances that had brought them together. But looking at Sarah and her daughter, Jacob knew he could not imagine his life without them in it. "Now we become a family," he said simply. "Not the way families usually start, but the way ours started. And we take care of each other." Sarah smiled, and Jacob saw that she understood. They had both lost so much, her freedom, his wife and child, their faith in a world that seemed designed to break hearts. But maybe broken people could heal each other. Maybe lost souls could find their way home in the most unlikely places. "Jacob," Sarah said, her voice growing sleepy as exhaustion finally caught up with her. "Yeah. Will you stay close? Just for tonight?" Jacob pulled his chair closer to the bed, close enough to watch over them both while they slept. "I'll stay as long as you want me to." As Sarah and Grace drifted off to sleep, Jacob sat in the chair and watched the sun rise over the mountains. The storm was over, the baby was healthy, and Sarah had survived what Mary could not. For the first time in 2 years, Jacob felt something he had almost forgotten how to feel. He felt hope. Outside, the snow began to melt in the morning sun, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of water running free.